On behalf of the May 1st organizing committee, on behalf of the May 1st organizing process, I would like to welcome all that are joining this webinar. I want to appreciate the organizations that made a commitment to participate and share perspective, on why addressing the question of war, imperialism, and international worker solidarity is important in this critical moment of world history. I want to recognize the panelists that are here with us today. Michael Lodom on behalf of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, Joe on behalf of the Malaya Movement, Manak Bayan San Diego, Janine Erica, Palestinian Youth Movement, and John Parker on behalf of the Socialist Unity Party, and myself, Benjamin Prado, on behalf of Unión del Barrio. This is the first in a series of political discussions that we'll be holding throughout the month. Looking forward to building a broader, more intentional class-conscious workers' movement to challenge our class enemies from escalating the war on the working class. This year's May 1st theme specifically is ending the war on the working class, because we felt it was necessary to diagnose clearly what the character of our struggle is, where we are at in terms of the conditions that the great majority of humanity confronts during this period of intensified class warfare. So to begin, the goal is always to create political and class consciousness amongst our workers' movement, and the framework that we're dealing with today, again, war, imperialism, what some may consider military-industrial complex, and the necessity of international worker solidarity. And just to provide just real quick framework, war is an expression of politics by other means, and politics an expression of economics based on class interests. Politically, the United States has demonstrated clearly what its priorities are and have been over the years, making unprecedented investments in war, invasions, occupations with the goal of wealth extraction at the expense of working people the world over. The question for workers within the US empire is, what interest do we have in the continued use of our resources to make war on humanity? And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Janine Erica on behalf of the Palestinian Youth Movement.
Thank you all. It's an honor and privilege to be here, and I'll do my best to keep it to 5 minutes. So apologies, it's only high level. I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement, a transnational independent grassroots movement of young Palestinians in Palestine and in exile worldwide as a result of the ongoing Zionist colonization and occupation of our homeland. And I set that context to say, what we really see in our history is starting after World War I, when the British and French had the Sykes-Picot Act and decided they were going to split up the Arab countries and the countries in the region, and the British Mandate of Palestine was created, and the British quickly began to hold all the means of production throughout Palestine and started dividing up our society and country. And in this moment, you see a lot of working class uprisings like the 1936 Peasants' Uprising, and this beginning and continuation, really this return to our homeland and back to a society that valued the working class and who had a place and role in society. So, in the Palestinian context, the working class are always part of the movement and have centered our fight for liberation. Right? And so the start of that really, and going into World War II, was the British backing and US support of the illegal state of the creation of the state of Israel, with funding, with military aid all across the region for this invasion. And we're already training what would become the Israeli Defense Force, or the Israeli Occupation Force. And to this day, the US materially supports this illegal occupation, specifically the military. The US provides the Israeli military alone, with about $3.8 billion each year to carry out crimes against the Palestinian people, to demolish homes, to murder us, to demolish lands, to imprison folks, all while we know that Black and Brown communities in the US are suffering from insufficient funding for healthcare, education, other basic needs. And that's only one physical manifestation of it, right? The other points that I really want to uplift is that from the colonial society, this is taken from the work of Dr. Al-Masri, is that colonial societies, whether in North America or South Africa, are military in nature, given the indigenous people's rejection of their presence. And Israel is no exception. Its society is weaved with military values, and its residents proudly describes themselves as armed people. And this society is set up as a military society. We saw increased arms last year by Israeli settlers and soldiers during the occupation attack on Sheikh Jarrah, which was a Palestinian village in East Jerusalem, which is facing expulsion and trying to make it into another Palestine city. And so the military and imperialism is funded by the US, is trained by the US. I mean, this is the reach, it goes beyond anything we can see. We have LAPD, Minneapolis PD, SDPD are all officers, all get trained and sent to be trained in Israel by Israeli occupation forces to use the tactics that they use in Palestine in the US in the US and on our sorry about that. My Wi-Fi dropped. The last thing I want to say, because I think I was coming up on my time, is that we also see this as a form of global imperialism, right? And that the arms trade is directly tied. We know that the Indian government uses the weapons that are first tested out on Palestinians, Gaza. The Indian government buys it and tests it out on our folks in Kashmir. The World's Expo that was happening in Oakland, Weapons Expo, excuse me, that this is not unique. This isn't a singular issue. And we can't talk about the working class struggle without talking about the Palestinian fight for liberation and the illegal occupation of Palestine by the state of Israel, directly, materially funded in every sense of the world by the US government. And I'll pass it on to back to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Janine. Really appreciate that perspective. I'd like to express, the importance of raising this question of occupation, because we know that many times, if not most of the time, right, these illegal occupations are a direct result of U.S. War funding, right? U.S. Taxpayer paid for by workers here, the occupation of other places, of other nations, other peoples. I'd like to present and welcome Matsumoto Odom on behalf of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. Comrade Matsumoto.
All right, Uhuru, everybody. I'm Matsumoto Odom, International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. I want to salute everybody on the panel. I want to salute Chairman Malaya Movement, head of the African Socialist Party and Uhuru Movement, as well as President Kalambe and Nanette, head of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. I want to salute, like I said, you, Ben Hameen. I want to salute the comrades from Palestinian Youth Movement, Comrade John Parker, of course, and so many others that are a part of this. And I think that this is a crucial conversation for us to have, and I really salute Comrade Janine's centering of the question of colonialism. It's Chairman Malaya who's made the most significant intervention into communist thought by centering this question of colonialism as a mode of production. Generally is general for some communists, some socialists to suggest that imperialism is the highest stage of colonialism, that imperialism was brought by colonialism, but we understand that it's the Europe's assault on Africa, Europe's assault on the indigenous people of the Americas and subsequently Asia, that was a mode of production that produced the wealth of European society. So we can't talk about the military industrial complex without centering the colonial question, because if so, then we get these sort of separate conversations about what's happening abroad and what's happening here within the United States. So and then we understand, and or we begin to talk about colonialism simply as a policy, but not simply just a policy. It's the mode through which the world system that we live under was produced, and wealth was produced. So we understand that at every entry point of United States building wealth and power for us, it's come through the imperialist assault on other people, on colonial peoples, that whether it be against indigenous people, the theft of their land, the sort of violent theft of African bodies and African labor that built the wealth of the United States as well. But that also sort of allows for us to understand that the military becomes therefore a way through which the white world allows for their own workers, their own working class, a sort of working class made of colonizers to enter into a form of wealth production for themselves, right? We know that a white man who drops out of high school can make more money than African and indigenous women who go to college. And this is largely because of things like this, because of the wealth that the military industrial complex, the wealth that is produced. Secondly, I really salute the comrade because what Chairman Malaya notes is that what we call, what that people in Afghanistan people call our police the Marines. And in the United States, we call the Marines the police. So we understand in that sense that the domination of our communities here in the United States through domestic military services known as the police or Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, and all these other things are a direct connection to that. And then I want to also salute this idea of weapons proliferation, because you got a lot of people who talk about the guns and the horizontal violence that happens in our neighborhood, but not a single one of those gun companies are made by indigenous or African or Mexican or Asian people. And in fact, we know, for example, the research that I've done, you can look at, I think it's Project Yano has, not Project, it's the Committee for Demilitarization. I did an article a couple of years ago on their site, and it looks at this idea of sort of small arms proliferation and the way through which the United States has sent large arms abroad, but then colonial settler countries, colonial countries like Israel, settler colonial countries like South Africa, Rhodesia and stuff like that were responsible for sending those guns, the Uzis and the riot shotguns and all that stuff into our community. So I really would like to just salute everybody here, especially for centering the colonial question, because it's once we overturn that, right, overturning colonialism will produce the overturning of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Matsumoto. I really appreciate that intervention. I do want to just mention to all those that are attending, at the end of this roundtable, we will open it up to make sure that if there's people that would like to make questions or even ask questions or make a comment, we'll do so at the end of the roundtable. Next, I'd like to invite Joe Canero from Malaya Movement to please introduce yourself and
hi everybody.
Hi.
Hi everybody. My name is Joe Canero. I am from Malaya Movement. We are an organization that is a broad movement of individuals in various formations united under the common objectives of defending human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. We have chapters all over the country, and we basically formed around 2018 and we were a coalition of Filipino community leaders, faith leaders, academics, lawyers, youth, like activists and business owners and human rights activists who were concerned with the increasingly de facto martial law that's happening in the Philippines. Basically what's going on is we have a member of the Filipino ruling class, Rodrigo Duterte, who is the de facto dictator of the Philippines, who has now created a war on drugs that's killed an estimated 30,000 people, like 30,000 innocent people through extrajudicial killings. A lot of his main targets happen to be the urban poor, activists, unionists, lawyers, the press, and indigenous folks, peasants and farmers in the countryside. It's not a coincidence that a lot of his targets and biggest fighters are the working peoples of the Philippines. I think mostly because Rodrigo Duterte has proven himself not just to be a fascist dictator, but someone who is friendly to the US and colonial powers, friendly to foreign corporations. And his regime has been marked not just by violence, but by an increasing loss of sovereignty of the Philippines, and an affirmation of the Philippines as basically a neo-colonial project. But one thing that's a little bit promising, before we could go into a piece of legislation that the Malaya Movement is trying to pass through the U.S. Congress right now, there's an election happening, and it goes to prove like how much of a joke like democracy is in the Philippines, and in that the person running for president next is his daughter and then the son of a previous dictator. So essentially we have on the surface a neoliberal democratic country, but really beneath it, it is a dictatorship that's being run by the same ruling class. There are some measures that are being taken to try to kind of prevent this. And one of the recent measures that the Malaya Movement is trying to take is called the Philippine Human Rights Act, which was introduced by Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania. And it is a temporary measure that'll essentially suspend security assistance to the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police. The armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police are basically the weapon that Rodrigo Duterte uses to target the working classes and the poor and activists. So when you think about it, like a lot of like the weapons that are being used to target innocent people in the Philippines are actually being funded by American taxpayer money. As like since 2016, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars of American taxpayer money that's being sent to the Philippines. Like the Philippines is not an advanced industrial country. The only reason they're able to like get like this amount of weapons that's being used to basically essentially bomb indigenous people and destroy villages is through like American like security funding, and also through training through American forces. Just recently, the Philippines held one of its like largest military training exercise that was overseen by the U.S. military. Because of like the Philippines' rich resources and because of its strategic importance in America's fight to basically be the top economic power, it's one of the reasons why it continues to fund Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. So while it's essential that the PHRA passes as a temporary salve to at least hold some of the people accountable who have committed these atrocities, I think it's important to understand that Duterte is targeting like workers' rights activists and the urban poor and peasants and farmers for a reason. It's because they're the people that he deems powerless. But the biggest fighters against Rodrigo Duterte are almost always the working class and the working peoples of the Philippines. And I think that really goes to show that like empowering like the working classes of the Philippines and listening to them is and their connection with the other working classes and working peoples of the world, I think is the key to ensuring that martial law never happens again.
Really appreciate your perspective, compared to Jill. Very necessary in this historical moment, right? I'd like to also now introduce John Parker, of the Socialist Unity Party. John.
There we go. Thanks for having this important discussion, educational. Two years ago, I and my partner, let me set my timer here. 2 years ago, I and my partner visited Hiroshima, accompanying our son, who was he was going there on a scholarship, going to Japan. And so we happened to go to the Hiroshima Museum, where you learn about the horrible deaths, about one of the greatest war crimes in history. That was the dropping of the atomic bombs on both Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In a matter of seconds, 80,000 people died, and out of 140,000 who died mercilessly slower. And this wasn't over a military facility. In fact, school children had just been let out of school. And for those less lucky who survived longer, they were pleading for water because the burning heat made them so thirsty. But it happens that because of what was in the air, according to the doctors, water was the worst thing for their throats and had to be refused. So imagine just for a second, your child who's suffering, begging for water, and you had to refuse them, and witness their anger and their shock and their disappointment at your refusal. Sometimes at their last dying wish. I experienced that look of disappointment and despair from parents in Iraq when I went there with former US Attorney General Ramsey Clark, visiting a hospital as part of a fact-finding mission after Bush's war on Iraq. I remember very clearly looking into a hospital room where two parents were sitting, and on the left side of a hospital bed, they're trying to console their probably 4-year-old child who was dying a painful death from leukemia. And this was due to the use of depleted uranium that was used to bomb civilians in Iraq by the US and NATO. The cancer rate went up 2,000% from 1991 to 1995, but that statistic doesn't explain what I saw in the eyes of those parents looking at a child they couldn't comfort. So now the US is once again asking us to spill blood for oil, cutting social services to fuel this proxy war in Ukraine. In Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, millions have already been killed by US proxy wars, while leaving Libya and Afghanistan in shambles. And what we need here are jobs at livable wages. We need responsible policies based on science to survive the new strains of the coronavirus. Almost 1 million people, right, died here, prioritizing profits over lives. Well, capitalism here is now exposed like an open wound. Its proclivity towards war is just unacceptable. And today we face an unprecedented challenge to stop a possible world war. And we understand that the crisis of capitalism forces imperialist countries to desperately further siphon the surplus value we create and either steal or destroy the productive capacity of lesser capitalist powers like Russia. Russia's GDP is smaller than that of South Korea. With an almost neo-colonial economy, it's dependent on the exchange of raw materials, not the export of capital, to survive. And that's an important distinction because it explains why the fate of Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Syria, Zimbabwe, and other targets of US imperialism would suffer most if the US-led NATO forces are successful in this war, not to mention the threat of another NATO member state on the border of Russia, this time with potential nuclear weapons controlled by a Nazi-led military, the Azov Battalion and other names, the Aidar and Azov. Our historic mission right now is to expose how US imperialism's push in escalating its proxy war in the Ukraine exacerbates the crisis at home. $16 billion going to COVID funding was cut to send more billions in weapons to Nazi-led material battalions in the Ukraine. And when we see a gas station or cities of homeless people here in Los Angeles, we're reminded that the inflation rate is 8%, the highest rate in 40 years, mainly due to increases in food, rent, and gas because of that war the US created. We see a rise in fascist white supremacist groups empowered by this nation, allowing them to take trips overseas to the Ukraine to be trained militarily in how to create more effective January 6th stormings of the Capitol, and this time with even more Confederate flags. And we see Biden and Congress aggressively pushing to fund the most lethal white supremacist organization today, that's the police, whose killings of 1,000 people per year hasn't changed since it began being counted by the Washington Post in 2015, with the greatest percentage, of course, being Black and brown peoples. So we must highlight that fact that the US-led NATO proxy war in Ukraine is an extension of the war against us, so that our working class can understand the source and solution to their problems and begin by dismantling one of the most dangerous threats to humanity today, and that is US imperialism. And I'll stop there because I hit my 5 minutes.
All right, very thankful for all of you for laying out a very good analysis. I'm gonna go ahead and start my time as a member of Unión del Barrio, representing the interest, class interest of our communities as Mexicano indigenous peoples. As Unión del Barrio, we see this question of military war and its hostility as a permanent policy that it has implemented ever since its founding. Even the expansionist war of 1848 against Mexico to challenge and to overturn a policy of elimination of slavery as Mexico had gained its independence from Spain, which actually usurped all of the territory that is now known as Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nuevo Mexico, California, Arizona, all this territory that today has created a political border that denies our right as indigenous people to be on our own land. And, we come from this anti-colonial perspective to say that, this expansionist war of 1848 and its ideological premise of manifest destiny has evolved over the years in expressions of not only the Monroe Doctrine, which it intends to impose on Latin America for extractive purposes of natural resources, but also in the concept that Obama put forward under when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, this premise of American exceptionalism. And this is important to highlight because the more than $782 billion that was authorized this year for war, and the additional now $813 billion that is being put forward by the Biden administration for fiscal year 2023 highlight the crisis in which this economic system, completely unsustainable for humanity, has gone to the extent to justify and undermine, first international law, right? To not justify, but undermine international law, but to justify invasions, wars, and occupations as a matter of state policy. Again, the policy of the United States has been consistent ever since its founding. And so what we want to do is make sure that we create the class consciousness amongst not only our own membership, but also allied organizations and the general working class here to highlight that we have no interest in becoming complicit in the crimes of the United States and US imperialism, because we recognize that the United States has created this unsustainable relationship between workers internationally and their ability to hold on to their natural resources to create life conditions that are dignified, right? In the sense when we consider that it is estimated that less than 1% of the world's population control more than 50% of the world's natural resources, and that 20% of the world's population controls something to the effect of 96% of the world's resources. And that means that 80% of humanity must make do with less than 4% of the world's wealth, a completely unsustainable relationship. And we see the urgency and the necessity to unhitch our future as Mexicanos, indigenous peoples, from that of US imperialism create and join the rest of humanity to capture and recapture their natural resources. That's why we support the efforts and struggles of Venezuela to recapture their natural resources, the efforts of revolutionary Cuba to get that proverbial knee off their neck, right, of economic blockades. And we cannot sit silent, right, and see how the United States hypocritically wants to label other people as war criminals, when in fact the United States, right, is the one who has committed the most horrendous war crimes humanity has ever seen. When we consider that it has participated in more than 150 invasions and wars in other countries around the world. So our future is not with U.S. imperialism, and the necessity for international solidarity, especially in the context that we see today with not only pandemics, but also economic crisis as a consequence and a result of histories of colonial exploitation, imperialist wealth extraction, and the assault of who's leading this, right? The billionaire capitalist class attacking our very dignity, leading that offensive. We see the urgency of standing in solidarity, in international solidarity with peoples of the world and their fight for and their struggle for freedom, reclaiming their natural resources, their human labor, because it is at the end of the day workers who create and build, and it is the oppressors, the exploiters, the billionaire class who is intent on destroying and decimating when we are the ones who actually produce all the wealth. So we want to appreciate the participation of everybody on this panel. We do want to open this section for questions from attendees, those who are not only partner organizations in this process for building for May 1st, but also a discussion and dialogue. So we want to welcome any of the attendees that are here today to, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We can allow you the ability to speak.
While we wait for that, can I respond to something John said? Because I thought it was important.
Sure, Carmen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think John made an important point about Russia, for example. Because you got the United States with all this military might. I mean, hypocritical is giving it too much of credit to say it's hypocritical. Hypocritical is kind of like, well, like, if I'm speeding to work and I'm upset somebody else didn't use their blinker to change a lane or something like that, like that's me being hypocritical. But I think it's a part of their actual colonial policy to really mislead and deception, a form of counterinsurgency even. But I think that to mislead people about what's going on right now, and John talked about it. See, Russia makes no pretense of being a socialist state, but Russia did not enter into world capitalism as it is right now by the means of by the colonial mode of production, and for that reason, Russia sits on the outside of the Western countries, which all came about by way of the colonial mode of production. Hold on, which came about by way of the colonial mode of production, and NATO was created to maintain that colonial relationship with Africa and the rest of the colonized world. And this has to be seen, and we can only get to this when we center colonialism as a part of our assessment of the function of military industrial complexes and war centrally. So I want to salute John for that comment.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel? Also, those that are attendees, please indicate if you'd like to enter into this conversation. We can allow you to enter and speak.
Yeah, I really thanks to Michael. Thanks to all the speakers. This was really great information, great analysis. on here. Just the one thing to fill in the gaps a little bit on the Russia thing. It's very confusing. There's just a barrage of media crap going on, and we have folks in Donbass region, Luhansk and Donetsk. We've been working with an organization called Borotba and some other organizations there for the last 8 years. So we've got a lot of information from the region on things that were going on, and a lot of things that's missed. Like, it reminds me of this Ralph Ellison novel, The Invisible Man, not the Hollywood thing and the science fiction thing, but it was about how Black people are invisible in this society. And so it's the same thing when they're talking about the Ukraine crisis. They never mention the people of Donbass. Then those two regions have been bombarded by these Nazi battalions for 8 years. The United Nations even said there's been tons of war crimes. And on February 24th, it escalated so much. And they had been asking Russia to intervene to help protect them, protect their children. They're getting tortured and killed and raped. And I mean, it's just, Nazis do what Nazis do. And the Nazis are now officially part of the Ukrainian military. So they've been doing that for 8 years, and they've been pleading for Russia to intervene. And they pleaded on February 24th, it escalated, the bombings escalated, so Russia intervened. So what people should know, they were asked to intervene by the folks in the Donbass region to protect them. That was out of protection. So that's just the context I wanted to fill in there. That's it. Thanks.
And, it's really important to recognize, who controls the mass media, right? Because it's not workers. It's capitalist, they're capitalist enterprises, right? And so I think that that's important for us to always be aware, especially as working class people, because the saturation of information is very real. Even the different social media platforms, who controls them, right? For what interest do they throttle or even, silence any media that is in opposition to the narrative that they want to put out, right? So that's also important for us to recognize. That's why we need our own media. That's why we need to continue to build our own capacity to inform people. And that's one of the reasons why we hold these types of panels and discussions, right? There was a lot of talk even about, this question of Palestine is super important for us, right? And I want to highlight that, and thank Janine for coming on, because today more than ever, right? It's a responsibility that we have as internationalists, as people who understand and recognize the class contradiction, right? That we need to stand and be vocal, that our silence is complicity. Our silence, in fact, forms part of the general mechanism by which genocide and occupation is justified, right? And again, to the question of NATO, it was NATO who was responsible for the atrocious attack, in Libya. In fact, NATO's and its tentacles wanting even to come to the Americas by way of Colombia, right? One of the most atrocious capitalist U.S. Favored regimes in Latin America. That is actually killing off many union organizers, many indigenous land defenders, and who has the Colombian military has been committed to committing a whole bunch of assassinations of the former FARC as part of the peace process there. So, again, we have no loyalty to NATO. In fact, very much the opposite, right? We want to see NATO dismantled because it is precisely this war machine that is committing these horrendous crimes against humanity. So I don't know any other panelists or even member, attendee who would want to express perspective.
Sorry, thank you all. I have something that I'd like to say if no one who hasn't spoken yet hasn't gone or wants to go, I mean.
Please go ahead, Jenny.
If I just wanted to highlight, something that you said on that point, being that about who controls power and who controls media and narrative. And it's unfortunate to say that even here, we see who controls like these larger unions, right, that are meant for workers and for workers to really advocate for a just pay and a just environment. And we see that so many unions broadly, and folks in unions face a lot of ramifications when they take stances on Palestine. We saw this with the LA Teachers Union over the summer, or when they take stances on NATO. And often the feedback is, well, workers aren't there yet. But how do we know that? A lot of our workers are politically engaged, are tapped in, and have experienced the direct effects of militarism and colonialism in their homelands. And it's the way that so I just wanted to pose that to us as we work on, as we continue to advocate and fight for May Day and this end of colonialism, end of capitalism, is that often we see the weapon, the tentacles, as you said, Benjamin, of militarism, even in labor unions and stances that people can and can't take, and the direct ramifications it has on people's livelihoods.
Oh yeah, Janine makes an important point, but I think that's why centering this question of colonialism is not against organized labor, but it's to understand that you can never have actual organized labor within a colonial system, because many of these organizations or these labor unions, were crafted against African, Indigenous, Mexican, Asian people, and stuff like that. And even when we've been mixed into them, it's they're using our labor force to achieve their own goals, their own contracts they might have with defense contractors and stuff like that. Because as a graduate student at UCLA, we took a stance in support of the boycotts, divestment and sanctions movement, and many of us were doxxed and all that other stuff. So I think that what Comrade Janine is talking about is important, and to understand that we can't stop the war on the working class without ending colonialism. If that's how we're going to stop the war on workers and stuff like that. So I think this is an important conversation. And then I think someone else made a connection to the war on domestically and rent and stuff like that, which is all important conversations to have with each other.
Yeah, that's right. The comment was colonization and imperialism carry over in local policies. 30% increases in San Diego as part of the war on working people. Displacement through bombs and economics is war on the working class. So I think that's really important. John, what you want to?
Yeah, just in response to that, they spent, just since 2004, they spent $22 billion on this attempts to coups in the Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. But I was going to say something about with Janine's great comment about the unions, because that's the key, right? We gotta get to the rank and file and get away from the kind of. Sometimes you have to get under the leadership and get to the rank and file, because you're right. They have a very different view, and there's a lot of frustration with the rank and file. I mean, this thing with the, we talk about stuff, sometimes we got to talk about our wins too, like the Amazon labor union now in Staten Island. They want first Amazon union to win, and they didn't have the big, functioning organization of the big unions, that they started their own union. So I remember when I was a young person trying to get some of the unions to come in to help organize the place I was working, it was like pulling teeth. Sometimes it was hard, but once we did it, then they came along. And you notice how the Teamsters is now meeting with Chris Smalls from the Amazon labor union. And you can bet the rank and file was saying, look, you better help them out. And that's why I pushed the Teamsters leadership to go ahead and help them out, and which is a great thing. But yeah, we just gotta get a hold of the rank and file and keep everybody engaged. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, and not sure, Jill, you wanted to have anything else, or even all the other attendees who are here, please.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that like uh, the understanding that this is, toppling dictators like um, Duterte and other like neoliberal like presidents of the Philippines who have really just seen the Philippines as a source of like resources that they can just sell off to foreign powers. Um, the best kind of movement against it have been worker led. Um, and I don't and I don't think that that's that's a coincidence. And I think that it's also not a coincidence that the indigenous people that are being targeted by Duterte, that are being paid by U.S. arms, are the ones that are protesting his development projects. Like some of our indigenous folks in the Philippines are sitting on some of the richest deposits of minerals, I mean, in the entire country. And that's the reason why they're being like tagged as communist rebels, even if they're not, and then like getting sent threats and being arrested, and a lot of the times like just being murdered on their way home. And it's not just the indigenous people, it's all the activists who decided like through their work organizing workers, they wanted to go to the countryside and see what the situation is, and them being targeted too. But the Philippines has created mass movements against Marcos before and against dictators before, but all of that came through the discipline of labor workers and labor organizers who were able to kind of use that discipline and idea of joining together, because it's so far small groups of professionals and lawyers have not been able to stop it. It really has to happen through like a mass movement. And it, it's not just right and correct for it to be worker led. It makes logical sense. And like, it's, I'm definitely proud to see that. And I don't think it's also a coincidence that when we have searched for solidarity in terms of trying to get support of the human rights movement in the Philippines, it's almost always the worker-led movements from other nations and other groups here in the US that have been so responsive.
Later on, as part of this webinar series, we will have a panel that deals with the question of immigration and US containment of African, Mexican, and other indigenous peoples and communities. But one of the things that I did want to mention, right, is this constant militarization and the contracts. I know that Janine mentioned these expos where giant contractors, military arms contractors, get together, devise horrendous tools of oppression, of death, right? These tools of genocide. And at the last one that was held in San Antonio, we understand that they were openly rallying to make a call for declaring war on migrants and here on the U.S. colonial border. And so one of the things that we always see the connection, right, of how the industries that manufacture and create tools of death, are always the ones rattling the drums. And I think that part of it is, and fundamentally, is this question of colonialism, right? That Matsumoto was speaking to, that it is the colonized and oppressed peoples whose future, right, is going to depend on our capacity and our ability to organize to defend our peoples from this ongoing onslaught. But just to make the point that it is these industries that are profiting and building walls and building and arming the police as a standing army to contain our communities. And that's the area in question that we as working, because we are workers, right? We are the ones who produce and create wealth in this society. At least we're on the side of workers, right? And we see that local policies, whether they be street vending policies, whether it be more military grade arms in the hands of police, that even though it's spoken of in city councils and people say how much they want to support communities impacted by these things, but yet they unanimously support and give funding, more funding for police, for militarization. We have to say it, right? That again, it is a matter of colonial policy, a continuation of this colonial policy. And so, part of that is creating that consciousness amongst, as people say, rank and file working class, to really overturn that, right? I know we're very close to time. Anybody else want to say the last final words? Really appreciate those, the organizations that came on to have this conversation.
Thanks for letting us be here.
All right, thank you very much, comrades. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. It's a little bit under an hour, so hopefully it was fruitful, it was informative, and we look forward to the next panel as we lead up for International Workers' Day.